Depending on the calendar used, November 20th or 21st, 1979 was the first day of the Islamic year 1400, Awal Muharram, the first day of Muharram. On that day, Juhayman al-Utaibi, a leader from Najd, the central Arabian area, led an attack on the Kaaba. The Utaibi family had already been in conflict with the Al Saud, with the Saud family that provided the kings of Saudi Arabia. Juhayman proclaimed Muhammad al-Qahtani as the Mahdi and uh, could be described as having a Wahhabi or Salafi background and a Brotherhood background. I put a list of his doctrines on the screen. If you look at them closely, you'll see that most of them are extremely negative about the Saudi monarchy. He does not want there to be a king. He wants the ruler to be from the family of the Prophet, not from the Al Saud. He does not want Shias to rule, even though he has an idea that a descendant of Hussein will be the Mahdi who will come to remove existing injustices and bring equity and peace to the faithful. Although the Saudis talk about the Quran being their constitution, Juhayman did not believe that this was enough. He wanted to base the Islamic faith on the Quran and the Sunnah, not on the opinions of jurists. I don't know whom he had in mind. Perhaps it was Ibn Taymiyyah, who was a jurist, but this is very much in line with the Hanbali doctrine that is predominant in Saudi Arabia, which gives predominance to the Quran and to the Sunnah of Muhammad. However, he felt that there were equivocal interpretations. Taqlid means following these things blindly, and incorrect teachings that were given in the schools and universities in Saudi Arabia, and that one should reject any official positions. The last two listed on the screen had to do with rejecting worshipers of the partners of God, shirk. Now, normally this means Christians and Jews and other non-Muslims, but here includes worshipers of Ali, Fatima, and Muhammad, a kind of triumvirate. This is not exactly the triumvirate that one finds in Shia Islam. It is similar to a triumvirate that one finds in some of the splinter groups from Shia. In any case, he also had this idea of a puritanical Islamic community protecting Islam from unbelievers and not being involved in with foreigners. The Saudis put down Juhayman's revolt fairly quickly, and this represented a kind of sea change in Saudi policy. As a result, the Saudis, who had not really been lifting their conservative viewpoint in a very dramatic way, became even more conservative and became even more committed to a Salafi approach, the approach of the Wahhabism or Salafism, the first three generations of Muhammad and his followers, as understood in a very conservative and restrictive way. A few days later, there was an uprising in Qatif, which is on the shore or near the shore of the Persian Gulf, an area where there is oil. This was timed with the Ashura, the 10th day of the first month of Muharram. And I've always been surprised that there haven't been more uprising in this area. After all, this is the area with the oil. Many of the locals are Shia, but the Saudi regime is very, very strongly Sunni. The Soviets invaded Afghanistan around Christmas time in 1979. They came at the invitation of the socialist government, which was a client state of Afghanistan, and against to try to pacify the fighting that was going on. The Soviets quickly conquered the country and installed Babrak Karmal by December 27th. The response to the Soviet invasion was that Osama bin Laden, already very upset with the Saudi response to the invasion of the Grand Mosque, Osama bin Laden called for mujahideen, for freedom fighters, as we might want to call them, who had already been training as alternatives to the socialist government in pre-Soviet invasion days. Osama bin Laden was a member of a very prominent Saudi family. His father, Mohammed bin Laden, and his family firm had done the engineering for Mecca to transform Mecca from a small desert town to a town which could have millions of people come for the pilgrimage. They were very wealthy, very well placed. And bin Laden, Osama bin Laden, called for fighters to come to Afghanistan to repel the godless communists, the Soviet invaders. All this was in 1979. The United States had planned to celebrate the 14th centennial of Islam. I have on the lower right-hand side the letterhead from Islamic Centennial 14 and the letters that they put out. There was a consolidated resolution in the Senate in October of 1979. It never passed the House, but there also was the Islam Centennial 14 that had planned to have a number of events in November of 1979 and following. As you may imagine, the hostage crisis and, in fact, the ongoing Iranian situation put a big damper on this celebration. 1979 also saw what is sometimes called the oil shock, a second oil crisis. The first one was after the various wars between Israel and its neighbors in 67 and 73. This one was a response to the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty. And you can see a long line of 1970s cars. And for example, you could only fill your car on odd days if you had a license in which the last numeral was odd, and even days if the last numeral was even, and all sorts of other things. Now, this was a period of unrest in the Islamic world, and we can talk about a number of failures that seem to be behind this. Number one, reform movements seem to have failed. Gamal Abdel Nasser's idea of secular reform and of Arab socialism led to dictators in Ba'athist regimes in Syria and in Iraq and in Libya. It led to Egypt not doing all that well in terms of broad-based economic progress for them. Religious reform, moderate religious reform, by this point had not also been able to do much of anything. And slowly but surely, the religious movements began to be much more radical. As I said, there was a possibility that the Iranian Islamic Revolution might have been more moderate. That is not what happened. The second failure that many people like to talk about is the failure of colonialism. Strictly speaking, out and out colonialism was fairly short in this area. The Ottomans ruled until World War I. The British ruled for a period that was often only 30 years, if less than that. In Egypt, the Ottomans were out. The British ruled silently for a fairly long period of time, but the main part of British rule was from the 1880s to after World War I. During the colonial period, and in the areas that were under mandates, the British did not make much progress in terms of setting up civic structures that would support viable independent states. In fact, the way that they work very often has led to failed states or states in which a strong monarch or a strong dictatorial president seemed to be the only way that they would go. I mentioned Arab socialism, the Nasser approach, very specific. And again, I like to think of this as a failure. And then finally, one can talk about the United States and the colonial regimes not helping the Middle East, but I don't think the Soviet Union actually helped the Arabs anymore. And the idea of the third world really did not promote a healthy and growing economic base in this area. There was a sense shortly after 1979 that the Islamic Revolution in Iran created Islam triumphant. There had been a period before in the 1200s to 1300s when Sunni Islam could look back at recent centuries of triumph. Ibn Taymiyyah, a man of the 1300s, could say that in the past century, they had thrown out the Ismailis and replaced them, Ismailis or Shias, and replaced them with a Sunni regime. They'd expelled the Christians of the Crusaders. The Mongols, who were polytheists, had been converted to Islam. And that Asia Minor, an area that had been part of the Byzantine Empire, was rapidly being not merely Turkified, but Islamified. The Iranian Revolution in the United States, and I recall this from personal experience. Muslims in 1979, 1980, 1981 were strongly charged by the Iranian Revolution and did not participate so much in the idea of Khomeini as somebody who hated America, but as a dream coming true, much as what happened in Europe among some Muslims after the Islamic State in the 20 teens. The godless communism fell in 1989. Between 1989 and 1991, the Soviet Union basically shriveled up. In 1991, it declared itself non-existent and devolved into independent republics. The fall of godless communism helped the idea of Islam triumphant and making an Islamist approach. And by the term Islamist, many of us who use this term mean an idea that a religious Islamic response in political terms is what was called for. On the lower right-hand side of the slide, I have Al-Islam hu al-hal. Islam is the answer. Resistance to authoritarian regimes could be through religious institution and leadership. Remember that this idea of the Muslim Brotherhood is in contradistinction to the armed revolt and the armed takeover of the Baathists, of the PLO, of a number of other groups, and to a certain extent, even of these jihadists in Afghanistan and other areas. What was next? Well, shortly after 1979, Saddam Hussein and Khomeini got into the first Gulf War. They fought this very useless war until 1988. Shortly after that war ended, Hussein decided to attack Kuwait and created the first Gulf War. In Egypt versus Israel, Anwar Sadat was assassinated in October of 1981 on the anniversary celebration of the 1973 war. In Lebanon, the Hezbollah was created possibly by Iranian influence. Hezbollah is a term that is mentioned twice in the Quran. And the opening gambit, you might say, of the Hezbollah was creating the notion of a self-aware suicide bombing. This was not somebody jumping into the middle of fighting, hoping they would survive, but aware of the fact that it was unlikely. No, this was killing people by driving a suicide vehicle into a target. This. Were you on the phone with the student?